Have you ever wondered what would happen if something small, seemingly harmless, could unleash centuries of terror? In 1978, in the quiet town of Hexam, England, two young boys were playing in their garden when they unearthed two tiny stone heads, no bigger than 6 centimeters. At first they seemed ordinary, even fascinating, but what followed was beyond imagination. From the moment these stone figures entered their home, a dark, malevolent presence awakened. Cold chills swept through the rooms, shadows moved on their own, and whispers echoed in empty corners. Objects flew across the floor, and the children saw shapes and figures that shouldn't exist. Even adults could feel the sinister gaze of something ancient, intelligent, and terrifying. This is the true story of the Robson family, a tale of cursed artifacts, ancient magic, and relentless fear that changed their lives forever. Brace yourself, because what you are about to witness is not fiction, it's horrifyingly real. The story you are about to hear is real, and it is deeply frightening. In 1978, in the quiet town of Hexam in northern England, something happened that no one could have imagined. It began with two young boys, Colin and Leslie Robson, playing in their family garden one sunny afternoon in February. While digging in the soil near the old stone wall that had marked their property for decades, they discovered something strange buried about a foot beneath the ground. Their small, dirt-stained fingers touched a cold, rough surface that sent shivers up their spines immediately. Carefully, Colin, the older brother, brushed away the damp earth with trembling hands. Slowly, the first stone head emerged, revealing crude yet unnerving features. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare at the sky, filled with a rage that had lasted for centuries. Its twisted mouth formed a grimace of suffering, or perhaps anger, impossible to interpret. A few inches away, Leslie uncovered the second head, smaller, more delicate, but equally disturbing. The stone was dark green with black patches that looked like dried ancient blood. Each sculpture measured roughly 6 centimeters and felt strangely heavy in the boys' small, sweaty palms. The texture was coarse and icy cold, giving them an unsettling, almost sickening feeling deep in their bones. Even as the sun shone that afternoon, the air around the heads seemed colder. A chill ran down their spines. Colin wanted to bury the heads back in the soil, but a morbid curiosity held him back. Leslie insisted they show the heads to their mother Helene, who was preparing dinner in the kitchen. As they carried the sculptures toward the house, the boys noticed a subtle vibration, like a slow heartbeat, emanating from the stones. The air around them thickened, charged with a static energy that made the fine hairs on their arms stand on end. They entered the house, unaware that they carried with them a curse that had lain dormant for centuries. At 5 Oak. That night, the family slept in their separate bedrooms. A dull thud from the living room woke Helene. She shook her husband, who had been asleep deeply. They descended the stairs into darkness, their flashlight casting unsettling shadows across the walls. The living room looked as if a violent storm had passed through it. Cushions were scattered on the floor, photo frames lay broken across the carpet, yet the two stone heads remained on the windowsill, unmoved. Despite this, their presence felt more imposing and threatening than ever in the thick, oppressive darkness. Helene felt a cold breath brush her neck, as if some unseen creature was breathing deliberately behind her. Colin turned on all the lights, but the room remained icy, even with the central heating running normally. They cleaned up in silence, too terrified to speak aloud the dark thoughts that had taken hold of them. During the day on February 12th, Helene contacted an amateur archaeologist friend, Frank Wilson, who lived in Newcastle. He agreed to come that evening to examine the mysterious sculptures. While waiting for him, the house remained unnaturally silent, as if holding its collective breath. No birds sang in the garden, usually alive with cheerful chirping, and the neighbor's dog refused to approach closer than 10 meters to the cursed property. Frank arrived punctually with his analysis equipment. His professional confidence quickly faded. As soon as he entered the living room, a violent nausea overcame him for no apparent medical reason. He examined the heads carefully under his illuminated magnifying glass, declaring them likely of Celtic origin. The sculptures bore barely visible engraved symbols, resembling ancient runes long forgotten. He photographed the artifacts, but all the films came out mysteriously overexposed and entirely unusable. While measuring the female head, all the picture frames fell from the walls simultaneously. The deafening crash startled everyone, and an odor of damp earth filled the room. A freezing cold descended over the space, causing condensation to form on every window. Frank recoiled, pale, displaying a primordial fear he had never experienced before. He firmly advised the family to dispose of the objects immediately, Helene refused to keep the heads another night in her terrified home. The nights that followed were worse. Frank tried to study the heads, taking notes on the strange symbols and patterns, but every night, the artifacts seemed to grow stronger. Furniture moved on its own, doors slammed without wind, and shadows flickered at the edges of vision. The sound of breathing, low and deliberate, would fill the empty basement, and Frank would feel fingers brush against his shoulder even when no one was there. His wife, now aware of the presence, refused to go near the basement and slept in the living room, fearing what she could not see but could sense. Each morning, Frank awoke exhausted, the shadows receding just enough to lull him into a false sense of safety. Back in Hexam, the Robson children became withdrawn and fearful. Colin refused to go outside alone, and Leslie would not sleep in his room. They spoke of shadows that watched them, whispers that filled the empty corners of the house, and objects that seemed to move when they weren't looking. Helene tried to maintain normal routines, but even she could not ignore the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the house. Meals were eaten in silence, lights remained on all day, and even the neighbor's dog avoided the property entirely. As Frank continued his research, he discovered that the heads had once belonged to a cult in ancient Celtic times. They were said to contain fragments of trapped spirits, kept imprisoned in stone through rituals that involved blood and dark magic. The cult believed that if the heads were ever removed from their resting place, the spirits would awaken and seek revenge. Frank realized with growing horror that the boy's discovery had unleashed exactly what the cult had feared. The presence that haunted the Robson family was no longer contained. It was free, and it was angry. One night, the sounds in the house escalated. Scratching came from every wall, furniture toppled over on its own, and shadows formed shapes that seemed almost human. The children huddled in the living room, clutching each other, too afraid to even blink. Frank descended into the basement one last time, hoping to study the heads, but the moment he entered, the air became thick and heavy. A cold wind blasted through the room, extinguishing his lantern. He could feel unseen hands grip his arms, and a voice hissed in his ear, promising pain and suffering. His body froze, and all he could do was watch as the heads slowly rotated, facing him with eyes that burned like fire in the dark. Over the next weeks, the Robson house became nearly uninhabitable. No one could sleep, and the children's health began to fail. Helene prayed constantly, hoping for some divine intervention. Even Frank considered abandoning the research altogether, realizing that these objects were beyond human comprehension. Yet despite all his fear, a small part of him felt compelled to uncover the truth, to understand the forces he had unwittingly unleashed. The haunting continued relentlessly. Shadows crept along walls at night, whispers filled every empty space, and objects moved without explanation. The boys were terrified of their own home, and their parents were powerless to protect them. Frank, exhausted and shaken, began to see visions in the stone, fleeting images of ancient rituals, sacrifices, and dark figures moving silently in the shadows. The male head seemed to watch him constantly, its hollow eyes following his every movement. The female head occasionally tilted, as if nodding in acknowledgement, participating in some unseen plan. By the end of February, the Robson family was a shell of what they had once been. The children refused to leave their rooms. Helene moved only when absolutely necessary, and Colin Sr. barely slept, haunted by nightmares of hollow eyes and twisted mouths. The presence had become a permanent, oppressive force in their lives, one that no human could fight with reason or courage. The curse had been unleashed fully, and it was patient, knowing that time itself was on its side. Even Frank, a trained archaeologist, realized that he had awakened something far beyond his control. The heads were no longer mere artifacts. They were vessels of a malevolent intelligence, ancient and cunning, that sought to influence, manipulate, and terrify. Every attempt at understanding them only made the influence stronger, and every passing day increased the weight of dread in the Robson home. By March, the family could no longer live in Hexam. Frank advised them to leave the house temporarily. Fearing that prolonged exposure would permanently scar the children, the Robsons moved in with relatives. But even then, the heads remained in Frank's possession, and the oppressive aura followed him. Shadows lingered in the corners of his home, whispers echoed in empty rooms, and the scratching from the walls never ceased. The stone heads had crossed the boundary from objects to something alive, intelligent, and malicious. No one knows the full extent of the curse or how far its influence will reach. The Robson family survived, but their lives were forever altered. The Stoneheads continued to exist, silent yet alive, and anyone who comes near them risks awakening a terror that has waited centuries for freedom. The male and female heads of Hexam, small, unassuming, yet terrifyingly powerful, serve as a reminder that evil can lie dormant for centuries, waiting for the smallest spark to return to life, and once it does, it will never rest.